Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the regulatory challenges. And I know I'm supposed to start with disclaimer. I think I have no disclaimers to make. I don't have any financial relations to this particular area. Perhaps my only disclaimer that is relevant is, in speaking, my experience comes from working at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So while I've tried to include a broader scope than just the U.S. scope, that is my bias, and that is where I know about the regulatory framework. So I hope we'll be able to see how some of these things are used in a similar way by other countries. So the main questions that I feel I was being asked to address is there a regulatory framework that is relevant for the microbiome? What are the challenges in such a regulatory framework? And what research strategies are needed to suggest the regulatory or support the regulatory framework? So again, my frame of reference, my basic frame of reference is that my experiences from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. But I think it's also important to think about a frame of reference for how one looks at a regulatory framework. And obviously in talking about the microbiome, one is, the focus is really on the role that various microorganisms might have on health, and the host organization, how they interact with the genetics of the host organization. So it's really that microbial focus. But if we think about a regulatory framework, the focus then shifts to the kind of products that might affect the microbiome in a host organism. And in that, it's so hard to read these slides. Yeah. I thought my glasses were pretty good. In that context, the products are often categorized as prebiotics or probiotics, and it's important to recognize that, to my knowledge, there is no regulatory definition for those terminologies. They really are terms that have evolved with the evolution of these kinds of products and serve a little bit more in a marketing context. So to start looking at this area and how to present it, I did a Google search, claims about gut microbes. I know you can't read this, I can't read it either, so we're even in that regard. But it's just one page of the many pages that I came up with. And so clearly there are a lot of claims that are out there, there are a lot of statements that are being made about the microbiome and dietary components or other kinds of supplements that might affect the microbiome. Now, for a regulatory framework, one of the first things in the U.S., and I think this is true in other countries, is to ask what is the intended use of the product. And we tend to think of three main buckets in terms of the intended use of the product: to treat, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease, disease risk reduction, or maintaining the structure and function of the body. I hope those are coming out. Well, some of the slides didn't translate well from my system to the ILSI system. So there are then that regulatory box, if it's treat, cure, mitigate, prevent, that puts it into the drug category. It makes it a live therapeutic, a biologic. It might make it a medical device, and there are examples where probiotics have been medical devices. If it's disease risk reduction, it could still be in that same category of drugs, live therapeutics, medical devices, or it could be a health claim if there is an approved health claim for food or a dietary supplement. For items that maintain the structure or function of the body, the primary regulatory box that I'm going to talk about are dietary supplements, but keep in mind those types of claims could still put it back into the drug, live therapeutic, or medical device. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing mainly on things that could be dietary supplements. So then the implications for which regulatory box one winds up in, if it's in that first category of drugs, then there's a need for an IND, an investigational new drug, an application for investigation of a new drug, that needs to be in place and that process followed. If it falls into the health claim box, well then one would look at the safety of the ingredient. It needs to meet a safety standard, and there needs to be a health claim petition to support using that product. If it's about a structure function claim for dietary supplements, if, again, for a dietary supplement, there would be a notification for a new dietary ingredient. If it's for food, it should be related to, thank you, it should be related to the nutritive value, taste, aroma, or nutritive value, and it must be truthful and not misleading. So, I'm sorry about the misalignment. I didn't realize the translation. So I'm really going to focus more on those health claims and the dietary supplements, the things that apply to foods. I'm not going to talk about drugs and life therapeutics, just to recognize that much of what we've been listening to so far probably falls into that drugs, biologics, and potentially even medical devices, rather than the food and supplement box. So once we're dealing with something that's a food or a dietary supplement, to me there are two key factors, the safety factor and the labeling that is truthful and not misleading, including the use of any claims, and of course following all of the labeling regulations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about safety, but I think you have to say something about safety because it's critical. It's the manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that any ingredient in food is in fact safe. And within the Food and Drug Administration, there has been history of safe use. There's the GRAS process. There's the food additive petition process. FDA has a lot of information on its website about probiotic microorganisms, live microorganisms that are recognized as safe for use in food. Likewise, through the dietary supplement process, if it was on the market before DSHEA was enacted in October of 1994, then it's based on history of safe use, but there's also a new dietary ingredient process, so there's, which requires that the supplement manufacturer have a basis for the safety of the ingredient. And again, there's a lot of information on the FDA website. What the comments that I want to make about safety are what I regard as some of the challenges that need to be faced. And if we think about the basis of safety for food additives and GRAS substances, which is a reasonable certainty of no harm, that typically focuses on the minimal amount for a technical effect in the food. And that thinking may not be the relevant thinking for something that's intended to have a health or beneficial effect in the food, that those may be two very different levels within a food. And that I think another challenge in the food safety arena is that often ingredients classified as probiotics may not be well characterized. It may be a mixture of things. It could be a single microorganism, but then what about variations in that microorganism? So getting that well characterized ingredient that we know the safety of can be a challenge. And so I think there is a need for more coordination between the review for safety of an ingredient and the scientific evidence for a health benefit, how those things come together. So I'm going to now focus more on the claims and the nature of claims, and I know this is an international audience, so I wanted to be sure I recognize some differences in terminology. In the US, the term health claim applies to disease risk reduction claims. And in other countries, health claim may be any statement about the nutritional benefit of a product, so it may not be limited to disease risk reduction claims. Since I'm from the US, I will tend to use it in the US jargon. Excuse me. We're not really going to talk about nutrient content claims, so I won't go there. Structure function claims in the US, again, these are about maintaining health, maintaining the structure and function of the body. In other countries, terminology that is used could be general function claims, or general level claims, again, that about maintaining health. Some countries use the terminology of disease risk reduction claims or high-level claims to characterize what we would call health claims. And some countries also have child development claims. In the EU, I know that those claims are reviewed through the EFSA process. In the US, we might regard those as a structure function claim, and they would have to be truthful, not misleading, and related to the taste, aroma, or nutritive value of the food. So again, I will tend to use the terminology such that we have in the US. I just wanted to recognize that I realize there's different terminology used. Now, in the US, for dietary supplements, the US Food and Drug Administration has published a guidance document for substantiation of structure function claims. And there are 4 key elements in that substantiation document. The first point is to make sure that one understands what the meaning of the claim being made is. And that's looking at the totality of the label information and statements made about the product. What does a consumer take from that in terms of the meaning of the claim? It's sort of avoiding some of the hidden language to imply something that can't be substantiated. The second key point is the relationship of the evidence to the claim. So under that, I have several bullets. One is, does the evidence focus on the supplement that is the subject of the claim? The second is the effect being measured what is also being claimed for the dietary supplement? Where the third point is, were the studies based on a population that is relevant to the target audience for the dietary supplement? And the final point really deals with accuracy and conveying, to the consumer exactly what they will get out of that dietary supplement in terms of the extent, the nature, or the permanence of the effect that is being promoted. So those are things just really about making sure that the claim is clear. It's not a hidden health claim or a hidden drug claim. Now, in terms of looking at the evidence itself, I have the bullets here from the FDA guidance, but these bullets are very similar to what we look at for a health claim, whether it's the US approach or EFSA, Canada, Australia, any of the other countries that have an evidence-based review process. So the first part is quality of the evidence. The second part is the totality of the evidence that supports the claim. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that when we get to health claims, so I'm not going to dwell on this here. Now, in the US, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to substantiate structure function claims. They're not reviewed by the Food and Drug Administration before they're used on a product. But EFSA has, in fact, now reviewed several claims related to probiotics that we would have categorized as structure function claims. And the first 2 claims that were done in 2010, I believe, are a healthy and balanced digestive system and increasing or decreasing the numbers of microorganisms that a probiotic product could have that effect. And I'm sure most of you are aware that EFSA found that there wasn't evidence to support a specific effect of changing the number of microorganisms on health of the systems. So both of these claims were submitted and they were not supported. And just recently, there's a second EFSA opinion that has been issued. And in this case, part of the claim dealt with nutrient content claims, whether or not the product itself met the criteria for certain nutrient content claims, such as low in sugars, high in protein, source of calcium, source of vitamin D. And EFSA said, yes, the product does meet the criteria for those nutrient content claims. But then the rest of the claim went on for maintenance of lean body mass in the context of an energy-restricted diet, pursuant to the Article 13.5. And in that case, EFSA found that there was no evidence to support that part of the claim. So we have 3 examples where a structure function claim has been reviewed by a authoritative scientific body, and the evidence not found to support. Now, I found a paper that was published by Gibson et al. In Gut Microbes, and the paper actually was published from a workshop, and it came out after the first set of EFSA opinions, in which they identified the kind of work that is needed in order to substantiate probiotic claims. And they focused on study design, the need for large randomized controlled trials with sufficient statistical power, well-characterized probiotics that are being tested, and a limited number of endpoints in order to show either a beneficial health effect or a reduction in disease risk factor. They talked about the importance of biomarkers for beneficial health effects, and also defined clinical endpoints that would allow them to look at disease risk reduction. So it's that recognition that the research framework needs to be strengthened in order to have the evidence to substantiate these claims. So, some of the challenges then for structure function claim is making sure the meaning of the claim is well defined, that there's a relationship between the evidence to the claim, the quality of the evidence, and the totality of the evidence. So shifting then to health claims or disease risk reduction claims, these then characterize the relationship between a food or food component and reducing risk of disease or a health-related condition. In the US, it's viewed as a safe harbor that it allows you to not be regulated as a drug, but to allow the use of these products on foods. And it's very clear that they are not intended for treating, mitigating, or curing disease or preventing disease. And just to put a picture on it, does this have a pointer on it? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. Okay. Just to put a picture on it, if we think of health as a state where we're making structure function claims, then interventions that help reduce disease risk would be the health claim territory. As soon as we move into treatment, that is drug territory. So in most health claims, there has to be a specifically defined substance. Again, that challenge of defining exactly what it is the substance that is used in a claim, and then the disease or health-related condition. And I just put the definition from the FDA regulations on this slide of what it means to be a disease or health-related condition. And FDA in 2009 finalized its guidance on how it looks at the evidence for health claims, the systematic evidence-based review that it goes through to look at the literature. EFSA has a publication of the systematic review that it uses. Again, these are not the only 2 countries. I think there are a lot of common elements in how countries look at the scientific evidence. And in fact, it's one of the few areas we finally reached consensus on in Codex is how to look at scientific evidence to support health claims. So this is a diagram that I developed to help explain the FDA process, but the steps are very similar to what any systematic review is going to do. It starts with the totality of the evidence at the top, and then studies are removed that are not suitable for reaching a scientific conclusion about that health claim. That then gives a reviewer the evidence that can be used, and then from that, the evidence can be evaluated as far as its quality, whether or not it supports the claim or does not support the claim. So we can address the question of, is there credible evidence for the claim? If there is credible evidence, then in the US, we move into another process. Other regulatory bodies have different ways of dealing with that body of evidence. But generally, what most countries are trying to do is figure out whether the scientific evidence fits into the green box on this slide. Is it a body of consistent, relevant evidence from well-designed clinical and/or epidemiological studies that support the claim so we can move forward with a health claim? In the US, we also have this category, the yellow box of qualified health claims, but we won't get into that territory. So this just gives you an example of a health claim based on significant scientific agreement. I pulled soluble fiber because it's fermentable. Soluble fiber from certain foods may reduce risk of coronary heart disease, and there are conditions that are set in how one might go about using that claim, but that's a claim based on significant scientific agreement. So in terms of then what studies are useful in an evidence-based review, in the guidance document that FDA has developed, it lists the studies that are not suitable and those that are. So what are not suitable are review articles, meta-analysis, and I will say it's most meta-analysis. There may be some conditions where a meta-analysis could be used, but review articles, book chapters, abstracts, animal studies, in vitro studies, and studies that do not pertain to the substance or the disease. And believe me, they get submitted, even though they don't pertain. So all of those types of studies or reports can be useful for understanding background, understanding mechanism of effect, but they don't substantiate the relationship between the substance and the disease or health-related condition. For that, you need human studies that evaluate the substance-disease relationship, intervention studies, or observational or epidemiological studies. And in terms of determining whether you can draw a scientific conclusion, these are some of the examples of fatal flaws that pull a study out of further consideration. There's no control in the study, and it sounds odd, but there are studies out there with no control. They lack relevant statistics. They may compare baseline to endpoint rather than compare a treatment and a control. There may be key confounders of risks that are not controlled in the study. They might use a non-validated biomarker as an endpoint, and I think in the probiotic area, this is a major challenge where we don't have validated biomarkers that can serve as surrogate endpoints of disease. There may not be an independent effect that is evident from the study design. And again, when we're dealing with a poorly defined substance, that can be a real challenge in terms of drawing scientific conclusions. There can be observational data, epidemiological studies without intake validation. Those cannot be used. In the US, generally we would say that studies in malnourished populations are probably not relevant to the US population, or if the study is actually conducted in a diseased population, that's not likely to be relevant. So some of the challenges, certainly this issue of the use of biomarkers that are not validated as surrogate endpoints, variations in the microbiota. I think Cindy addressed this fact that there's clearly evidence that there can be responders and non-responders in the population, which complicates the data presentation. That often the studies that are conducted are secondary prevention rather than mitigation, or secondary prevention or mitigation of symptoms rather than a primary intervention to reduce disease risk. And often a challenge is characterization of the substance. Now, I have just a few minutes left, so they show me. But I do want to highlight, there was a workshop in October that was about bioactive substances. And in looking at the summary of that workshop, I was really struck with the similarity to what we're dealing with here. Bioactives are those things that don't have a defined recommended intake, but they do seem to have some health effects. So the similarities in terms of the challenges, the substance is not always well characterized. There may not be a single compound, read microbe, but a group with similar activity, and that these substances may often exist in a matrix, and it needs the matrix in order to have its beneficial effect. So I found there was a lot of similarities. And there were several recommendations from that workshop. There, the focus is creating a DRI framework, but I think many of the recommendations that they came up with definitely apply to this area in terms of thinking through what is the research strategy we need to implement if, in fact, we want to produce evidence that leads to claims. So I come back to my picture, and as I've gone through very quickly, we can have drug claims, we have health claims that help reduce risk, and we have the structure function claims at the health end. I think what the probiotic area is starting to show us is that potentially what we're missing are claims about the dietary management of individuals with disease. And in reflecting on some of the earlier presentations, that often seems like the challenge we're faced with. How do we deal with that population, understanding their nutrient needs or their health needs because of that disease state? So in conclusion then, I have my main questions back there. Is there a regulatory framework? The current regulatory framework is based on intended use. What are the challenges for a regulatory framework? Certainly the study design needed to substantiate the claim for that intended use is a challenge we have to face up to, and also characterization of the substance for the claim. What research strategies are needed to support the regulatory framework? The research approach must be relevant to the systematic reviews that are used to evaluate the evidence for claims. We have to think about those systematic review processes and what it means in terms of the research designs that will be successful. So with that, thank you.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Schneeman?
Very nice. This is Elaine Krull from DuPont Nutrition and Health. And this is more of an education on my part, but our probiotics, if you want to make a health claim, our probiotics have to go through CBER or do they go through CISAN? I'm still confused myself. And then that's probably the main question, so that because when you say we need more research studies, and absolutely we need well-designed research studies to do the health claims. But then when we do, and I know the FDA's backed down from filing necessarily the need to file an IND for a food ingredient, and that would be maybe even a probiotic. But when you do significant clinical studies based on Article 912, that makes it a drug. So I'm still confused as to how do we move forward in this area, and maybe you have more insights onto the progress that's been made in those specific areas.
Yeah, and the challenge is it all starts with that, what is the intended use of the product? That is the first question. And so the nature of the claim that's being made defines the intended use of the product. So is it to treat, cure, mitigate, prevent disease? Is it to reduce disease risk? Is it structure function maintaining health, structure function of the body? Once you have that intended use, then several other steps follow from that. Now, I will agree with you that I think when FDA issued its guidance on what requires an IND, it did confuse the issue because reading that guidance, one would say, yes, you need an IND to do research in this area, again, depending on the nature of the claim that is going to be used for the product. And at this point, my understanding is FDA issued that as a final guidance. It reopened the comment period on the food and dietary supplement section, but we don't know where that's going yet. We haven't seen that finalized, but likewise, FDA hasn't pulled that part of the guidance either. So I would say it's still a little bit of an unknown.
Thank you for your presentation. It's a curiosity question. We don't have data on that, so we won't be able to address that. But I was wondering if the combination of the skills of microbiology and nutrition is probably one of the challenges of this area from the regulatory perspective, because most of the panels, the NDA panels at EFSA is composed of nutritionists, and we nutritionists are used to inert magnesium, calcium, macronutrients that we know how. This is a living organism when we talk about probiotics, and it might be more complex. It might be requiring really the multidisciplinary approach between nutritionists and microbiologists. And maybe what we think is relevant as a methodology for pure nutrients is absolutely different from a probiotic.
I think you raised excellent points. Obviously, it does require a certain expertise to look at something that's a probiotic, a microbial mixture. FDA can get access to that expertise. That I'm confident in if they are able to move forward in that area. I think the challenge we're faced with, again, is how well is the product characterized? You know, can it be characterized in a way that makes sense? Whether you're a microbiologist or a nutritionist, can it be characterized? And what is the nature of the claim? I mean, so many of the claims that I've heard keep coming back to cure, treat, mitigate. And that's why I raised that question at the end. You know, we've had these nice, neat boxes for several years now, structure, function, health claim, and drug, life therapeutics. Are we reaching a point where we're beginning to see that there's another box that has not been defined? We don't really have a way of approaching it. And quite frankly, it's scary territory for a regulator because it blurs the line between when you're a drug and when you're a food. And, you know, at the end of the day, the goal is to protect consumers. That's what FDA is trying to do. So whatever it does, it wants to be sure it protects consumers in that process. So yes, I think it raises some interesting questions of, are we ready for rethinking our framework around claims?
Hi, Barbara. This is Deanne. Let's go with Biofortis. And I really hope that we hear some more on that last comment on the panel. But I had a question maybe you can comment on that might relate to that, and it's about blurring the lines a little bit too. But on a couple of your slides you had at the bottom of the box related to foods, and you mentioned this, the requirement for aroma, taste, aroma, or nutritive value. Can you comment on how that relates to, say, probiotics and foods? Because with supplement, that's not a requirement. So if you want to look at probiotics and foods, how would that?
Right, and quite frankly, what you really need is a lawyer to help you with that because it gets into the law. And with DSHEA, structure function claims were specifically put into DSHEA in terms of claims that the dietary supplement products could use. So it's defined for dietary supplements. In the case of food, the primary thing we have is a court case, the, Schweiker versus Nutrilab. And it's in that case that the decision was made, structure function claims that are based on taste, aroma, and nutritive value might be appropriate on food as long as they're truthful and not misleading. But my understanding of that case, and people can challenge me because my understanding may not be correct, my understanding of that case, it was, again, to prevent someone from just simply putting a substance in food as an alternate way to delivering a drug. And now I'm going to call you a food rather than a drug. So again, the thinking was, how do you protect consumers?